Okay, welcome back. So we are just finishing up our final review of images and going off of the 40 images on the review guide. And so when we last left off, we were talking about Caravaggio, and so that was a perfect setup then to talk about Rubens, because I talked about Caravaggio's influence, his uh, his form of tenebrism, and the kind of influence it had on Baroque painting. And that leads directly to Rubens, who, although the way he painted was a little more colorful and more atmospheric in terms of using color, and his spaces are dark, but they also have lots of shift and nuance to them. But there is definitely a strong influence from Caravaggio. Okay, so some of the things that you could say about this image are: number one, it's an oil painting. Number two, it's a triptych, meaning that it's a painting made up of three parts. The center part being the one that we tend to focus on, but it is actually a three-part composition. And um, number three, it's a example of Baroque painting that we have talked a lot about how Rubens in some ways is the epitome of the Baroque artist and Baroque painter, both in his career and in his work. Um, and there are lots of other things in terms of like the strong corner diagonal, and then these other diagonals that go from the other corners towards a right angle meet at that corner diagonal, and some of the other compositional issues, creating a focus through strong value contrast on the figure of dead Christ. Um, and so, and there's a whole bunch of others that you could talk about. And since you wrote your paper on this, I think you have you should almost certainly be able to say something about this. Remember, the paper was a comparison analysis between this Rubens' Descent from the Cross and Max Beckmann's. All right, let's move on to the next one. If I can get a cursor, there we go. Okay, so the next set of images on the study guide are all prints, and so one of the main things we're just going to talk about is the different types of printmaking. So this first one is an engraving, which is a type of intaglio. Remember that the main difference between intaglio printmaking versus, let's say, relief printmaking is that in intaglio, the surface is scored, it's marked, right? But the cuts that you make into the metal plate in intaglio, those are the things that hold the ink, as opposed to in relief printmaking, where it's the exact opposite. The areas that you cut are the areas that are going to be light, and it's the areas that you leave behind that are the things that get inked. Um, so also it's a, um, a Northern Renaissance work. It's a Durer, and anything else I wanted to say about this one? Um, and I guess the other thing to say about engraving as opposed to other types of intaglio, right? The main thing that's different about engraving compared to um, etching is that in engraving, the artist, the person who makes the plate, has to do that work physically, and it's a very hard physical effort to actually score every single line. It requires both a whole lot of strength and a whole lot of control, and to do it so effortlessly and so gracefully as Dürer is doing here is just incredibly impressive. Um, and then related to that, you could also talk about the way it uses value, um, because if you really examine this image, every area of value is created through line, through either change of line weight, but a lot of kind of build up of mark making, lines going in different directions, many of them following cross contours of forms, but all of them kind of being different forms of hatching and cross hatching lines. Um, some of the hatching and cross hatching lines don't go, they just go in kind of random directions, like say these diagonals right there. But a lot of them are actually following the form in different kind of cross contour directions and helping to define the form, like the turn right there on the musculature of the horse. Um, okay, so there you go. The next one um, is an etching. So actually there are two etchings here, this one and the next one, both by Rembrandt. And probably the main things that you can remember about etchings in general is that uh, like the main difference between an etching and an engraving is that in an etching, the process they tried to figure out a way to take a lot of that effort out of it. So the acid does the work instead of the muscles of the artist who's doing the engraving. So in an etching, the whole plate's covered with the ground, and then that ground, as the artist is doing their drawing, that ground is scratched away, but that's a much lighter kind of scratching type mark. It doesn't require the same sheer, physical strength that engraving does. And then once the first set of marks are made, then the plate is brought to an acid bath, and everywhere that the ground has been scraped away gets etched by the acid, thus an etching. And the other thing, and of course this is an example of Baroque art, this is a Rembrandt, and the other thing that you could say about this image specifically is that it represents one of the things we talked about Rembrandt and his intaglio process was that he really embraced how much you could kind of, in the process, look and rethink and re-edit and rechange compositions based on you work on the plate a while, then you print a test, you see how it's turning out, and then you make changes. So specifically on this image there, we have other prints where he had done different versions, and then he eventually wiped away whole areas, sanded away whole areas, and redid them so that at one point the figures went all the way across this part, but then he removed those and put this large kind of block and this kind of dungeon, oops, sorry, going back, this dungeon kind of windows down here at the bottom, uh, and it makes a much stronger effect. Um, okay, so that's one thing. All right, and then this is also a Rembrandt etching, and um, so once again, it's a form of Baroque painting. Another thing that you could see from this is how much, one of the things I love about this piece is how much he is, some areas are really built up with lots of lines, create a lot of kind of rich tone, and then other areas, because they're really in light or for other reasons, other areas are almost entirely just a line drawing, just a line sitting on a overall light space. And how beautiful that transition is from that figure to there. And to be able to do that in a way to make this figure come out is truly impressive. Um, Another thing about this particular etching that I think is really interesting is, or that is kind of specific about Rembrandt's etching technique, is how much he was a very kind of intuitive inker, where in terms of the way he would wipe, he would he would purposefully wipe away some areas very, very heavy, so that there was almost no ink, that the only ink on the plate was the ink cut into the deep lines, and then other areas he would wipe away light so that even the lightest lines would pick up ink, but sometimes even there'd be a little bit of tone just left directly on the plate. And that kind of, um, now, for printmakers, it's really important that editions be consistent. So some may be critical of Rembrandt for this kind of technique, but nonetheless, Rembrandt was a genius at doing this, and it gave him beautiful prints. All right, the last print that we're talking about in this set is this one by Daumier. So all three of the first ones we talked about are different forms of intaglio prints, meaning they are prints where a metal surface plate has lines cut into them, and those lines then hold the ink. This print is actually a form of lithography. It's a lithograph. And lithography, if you remember, is a planographic form of printmaking, meaning that the surface is really not cut into anyway, although it is kind of purposefully rough, but there's no either cuts in the surface that hold ink or no cuts in the surface that raise up to hide or cut away to hide from the ink. The thing that makes the ink either stick to the block of stone or not is a chemical process where, the artist does a drawing with a waxy-based crayon, and then through a series of processes, he's able to treat it with water and then roll ink over it, and everywhere that the wax crayon is will pick up the ink, and everywhere that the water is resists the ink and stays light, and then you can print that. So that's a lithograph. This is Daumier. Another thing about Daumier that I'm a big fan of Daumier, and I love his figure drawing. One thing I would like to say about this particular image is that, Daumier worked for newspapers, and his job in some ways was kind of like uh, it was all kinds of different things combined. Like, to a certain degree, part of his work was almost like being a cartoonist or a political cartoonist, and part of his work was like what a newspaper photographer would be like. He was just went out to see things that happened, and that definitely is what this particular piece is about. Okay, so the last image I want to talk about on this set, the second of the three, is this painting. Number one, it's an oil painting. Number two, it is a Baroque painting. We talked about Poussin primarily because of um, the spread of the Baroque into France, and Poussin as being sort of the artist that we look to who really um, founded the French Baroque school of painting. And we also look to Poussin as kind of to symbolize the kind of the tension within Baroque, especially within French Baroque painting, between, on the one hand, a more loose and a more gestural and a more transparent use of paint, but then at the same time, the desire, almost you could call it sort of a pre-neoclassical desire for clarity of drawing and seriousness of purpose. Um, the other thing that we talked about this painting was we talked about it in terms of composition. When we were talking about page structure and corner to corner diagonals, right? And this painting has got them. And we definitely talked about how um, this painting really represents um, that idea of how if you compose really around the geometric page structure, how it can add a certain sense of stability and permanence, almost um, a statuesque, frozen kind of quality to the composition, um, and the way it makes this kind of triangle right there. Um, okay, speaking of triangles, we will be talking about the Romantics, Delacroix, next.